So in this video, we're going to be building a simple state management utility for our application using the React context API. State management is a big deal in front-end applications, especially single-page applications. So we're going to be building something like that looks like a mini Redux. A lot of React users are familiar with Redux. Redux is a Flux-based state management library. But now that we have the context API, we can have something that is built into the core of React for managing how we pass data across to components. And the context API really performs wonderful when it comes to that, when it comes to passing data down through a tree of components. So let's just get right into it. Let's go into our source folder, and to create that state management utility, I'm going to create a file just right inside the source folder called state.jsx. state.jsx. Okay, good. Now the first thing that we're going to do in our state file is to import React. Import it from the React library. We're going to import React from React. We're also going to be importing two other utilities. That's the use context, or rather create context utility, and also use reducer. So it's use reducer and create context. Those are the other two utilities that we're going to be requiring from the React library. So we have those two, and next let's create an app context. Let's create a context for our app context. Let's set that equal to create context. So let's just create context, and we'll initialize that with an empty object. So that's good. The next thing we're going to do is to just set up an object to represent our initial state, the initial state of our application. So I'm going to say const initial state equal empty object. Let me just put the name of the let's put the parameter here, or property here rather, and call it app name. So the app name will be WhatsApp. So that's good. This will represent the initial state. The next thing to do now, this initial state will be used in our use reducer function. So we also want to create a reducer function. We also want to create a reducer function that would control how this state is managed. So we set our reducer function, which takes in the state and the action. State and action. Good. And inside here we can simply just switch on the action to know the type of mutation that the user is trying to do. And let's say we are trying to change the app name. Let's say change app name, or something more appropriate, let's say set app name. So if the user is trying to change the app name, say set app name, and we can simply say okay. For that, simply let's set this to an object, and we just simply return the current state and the app name to whatever the user is passing in the payload. So we're going to assume a payload object that will be passed into, let me make this triple so that I can spread appropriately. So we're going to assume a payload to be passed with the action here. For the type of action, we're going to assume a type, so action.type, then action.payload.app name. So whatever is passed as the app name to the payload object for the dispatch function, which we're going to be using in use reducer, that is what is going to be set as the app name. So if the dispatch function calls this type of action, checking action.type, if the type of action we get is set app name, then we set the app name to what is specified inside a payload object that we're going to assume as the data transfer object for every dispatch operation. So let's just, this should be okay. So now we have our initial state and we have our reducer. The next thing to do is to create a provider component, to create a provider for our app context. So we're just going to say app context provider. This will make sure that our context is available to our application. So in there we pass in props, definitely. Then we define our app state. So app state will be equal to an object in which we just spread the initial state. Okay, that takes in the initial state. So we can use this together with our reducer to set up use reducer, passing in the reducer function that we created and our app state. Okay, app state. So here we set up use reducer and we just deconstruct the array to get our state and our dispatch. Then we can set this, you can say let value, we can set this two values into an object, state dispatch. So we set these two properties, state and dispatch, into this object and we give it the name of value. This is the value that we're going to be passing into the component that we're going to return. So we're going to return the provider component, and that will be app context dot provider, and we set its value to equal value. Simply close on that, and within that we have the props.children, which will be the child component that would be able to access all this. Let me just toggle this so that so that we can see the whole thing. I'm also going to put this aside. So we set up a provider, so any child component that's passed into this provider, we have access to these two properties passed into value. We have access to this. So here we have our app content provider. Good. So out of this file we can simply just export as a default, export an object. So we export our app context and our app context provider. Good. And that completes our state management utility. So let's run through this once again. So first we import React and also the create context and the use reducer utilities from the React core library. Then we create a context for our application, initializing it with an empty object. Next, we set up an initial state and a reducer function which takes in the current state and an action property or an action argument. This action argument has a type and also a payload in which we're going to be passing in any data that we want to use to mutate our state. So within this reducer function, we have a switch statement that checks the type of action that we are passing to our dispatch function and returns the mutated state as a new instance or a new copy of a state. Let me not mess that up. Okay, good. So we have that. We're currently using it to set the name of the application, and that's the only check that we have. As we build the application, we're going to be adding more to this. We're going to be adding more checks, and we're also going to be adding more to this state. So down here we now create our app context provider, which is a component in which we set up the state for the application, where we set this up as an object that is initialized with the initial state, and then we use this app state and this reducer function. We use them to set up our use reducer utility from the React library. We deconstruct the return value from that to get our state and our dispatch properties, which we also use to create this value object, which will pass into our provider component that would enable every children that is wrapped within this app context provider to have access to this value, which is state and dispatch. Good. And we simply export our app context and our app context provider. Good. So the last thing to do, which is to install this utility into our application, is to simply go to, sorry about that, simply go to index.tsx. Find index.tsx. I'm just going to close it a little bit. I'm going to remove all this. So within index.tsx, I'm going to import the state management utility, that's state from state. Yeah, so import state from state. Just going to import that, and declare but is never read. So, oh sorry, I only need the app context provider actually, so I can just deconstruct state and just pick the app context provider. That's all I need. Now I'm going to create a new component here and call it a root component. This will kind of be a higher order component that would wrap our app component, which was our root component before, which will wrap it inside this app context provider. So this root component will simply return our app component wrapped inside our app context provider. And with this, automatically we're able to get access to our state management. So the last thing we'll do is take our root component and replace app with root component. So this now becomes the root component of the application, which is an enhanced component that is able to take advantage of our state management utility. Let's go to our browser to make sure that our app is still running. Let's refresh that. It's fine, everything is fine, so nothing breaks. Let's test out let's test our utility. So I'm just going to go to the to one of the pages. Click on page, go to tab1.jsx. Let me close it up. Okay, tab1.jsx. So here, what I'm simply going to do is replace this with the name of the application, and I'm going to create a button in here that is going to change that is going to change the name of the application. So the first thing I need to do is import the app context. I'm going to import that from our state. So I'm going to import it from our state utility. Then after doing that, the next thing is to set this up. To set it up, I'm going to use the use context utility. Let me see if that is imported. Use context. Okay, good. So we have use context. I'm going to just set up using use context. I'm going to pass the app context, and I can now have access to state and dispatch. State and dispatch. So I have access to the two. So within here, I can simply just change this tab 1. Instead of reading tab 1, I will say state.appName. State.appName. And if we go back to our state utility, you see the app name is currently WhatsApp. So this page should now have a title of WhatsApp. So let's just save that and go to our browser. Refresh. Let me refresh that. Okay, I hope I'm changing the right thing. Let me go back to the code. This or this. Okay, let me see if this is what I'm supposed to change. Sometimes these two gets kind of confused. So let's go back to our application. Yeah, as you can see, WhatsApp. So we now have WhatsApp changed. Let me change this to Galaxy 5. Refresh. Okay, let's just make sure that's the same on Android and iOS. So as you can see, you have to refresh whenever you change this font type, you have to actually refresh the page to make it take effect. So as you can see, we have changed the state. We're now using the state to detect what the title of our page is. And next thing we're going to do, let's see how we can use dispatch to actually change that name. So let's assume I have a button somewhere here. Let me remove this component and just replace it with an ion button that says change name. Let's just make sure that this button is showing up. Okay, so we have the button here, change name. So what would change name do? Change name is simply going to change the name. So we set an on-click function or event handler, which would simply just call our dispatch function and pass in an object. This object will have a type of set app name. So it will have a type of set app name, and it's going to have a payload with app name set to, let's say, clone. Let me just say clone, just for demo purposes. So I'm just going to change the name from WhatsApp to clone. So we have that set up. Let's go to our browser. Let's make sure that it's well refreshed. So once I click change name, you'll now see it has changed to clone. The title has been switched from WhatsApp to clone, which confirms that our state management utility is now working and we are able to successfully mutate the store.